Hello, welcome to the Art of Scientific Storytelling podcast. I'm Dr. Ed Perper, CEO and founder of Science Branding Communications, which is a scientific storytelling agency. I hope there are people out there like me who love science and love communicating science, and that's why we created this podcast. The podcast is for people who want to take their scientific presentations to the next level, whether you're a scientist, a physician, speaker, medical science liaison, whatever your audience is, and you're trying to get complex science or maybe not so complex science, challenging science across to your audience, we're here for you here. So this is episode number 3. Hope you listened to our first 2 episodes. Today's episode is entitled, Does Scientific Storytelling Really Work? So we believe that scientific storytelling and storytelling in general is the way to communicate science, particularly complex science, because people are hardwired to engage in and share stories, including scientific ones. But we also realize that in many cases, it takes time and effort and expertise, frankly, to create a great scientific story. So you could very well rightly ask, is it worth this extra effort? We're all very busy. Is there a sufficiently high payoff in using storytelling as a communication technology rather than what you're currently using? And that's what we're going to talk about today. In particular, we're going to talk about what's the evidence that storytelling is a powerful way to communicate science. Is there such evidence? There actually is, and we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to ask a very important question just to ground us, and that is, why are we even talking about this topic? We're talking about it because we want our audiences to understand our science. We want them to understand it because only when people really understand the science and what you're saying will they connect with it, with your science or with your product, whatever you're trying to get across. And only when they connect will they act. So ultimately, it's about improving the lives of people that we're trying to communicate with and the people that they communicate to. In our case, it's about science and healthcare, medicine, new drugs, old drugs, the way that drugs work, the way that various technologies work, devices as well. And we're trying to improve the lives of people, and communication is often a great way of doing that. So I've been in the medical communication field for over 20 years. I was a cardiologist before that for about 15 years. And over the years that I've been in medical communications, I'll be totally honest, I've heard some arguments against storytelling over the years. And I want to share some of those with you. And I want us to take a look at those, an honest look at those questions, at those arguments. One of the things I've heard is that audiences, especially regarding healthcare professionals and especially physicians, the argument goes, don't care that much about how you communicate the science. All they care about is the data, the efficacy data, the safety data. That's what they're going to make the decision about, and they don't really care about anything else. That's how the argument goes. They don't want to lecture on the pathophysiology of the disease. They don't care that much about the mechanism of action, arguably the core science of any drug presentation. And I've heard this numerous times, actually. They'll point to their own personal experiences of speakers trying to explain the science in the most elegant way they can and failing. And they'll tell me it just doesn't work. And the thing is, this argument is partly true. Some people don't care about the science. But in my experience, many people do. And this includes healthcare professionals and physicians, as well as other healthcare professionals, pharmacists, nurses, physician assistants. I would say, I don't have actually evidence for this, but I would say based on my personal experience that at least 50%, and in many cases, a good solid 3/4 of audiences do care about the science and will be impacted by it. And they're genuinely interested in knowing more about it if it was explained in a good way. My counter argument to the problem being stated as, I've seen people that do science stories and they don't work, it's sort of like going to a couple of bad movies in a row and concluding that all movies are bad. That's just bad logic. So this resistance to scientific storytelling is quite common, unfortunately. It's not the communicators, the speakers of the science, that are really failing. It's the particular way that the speaker is communicating it. And I think that this is a misunderstanding and misconception about storytelling, because storytelling has been blamed for a failure that's really not the fault of storytelling per se, I think is what's really going on. Now, a second argument against storytelling is that it's really for fiction, for movies, novels, not for science. It's not credible. This is a fairly common belief as well. It's one of the reasons that I have, over the last few years, used the word narrative rather than the word story. I looked up to see actually what were the synonyms. Were there any synonyms for the word story? Believe it or not, I really found only one word, and that word is narrative. So the word narrative doesn't have a lot of the baggage that story does. Some people are really allergic to the word story. And so for them, I think it's fine to use the word narrative, but they're really synonyms. The truth, though, about the relationship between storytelling or narrative and fiction and nonfiction, the truth is that the communicators of nonfiction, and science, of course, is nonfiction, use storytelling techniques all the time. Think about Scientific American. Think about Nova, the science documentary series on PBS. Think about the Discovery Channel. Think about the multitude of science documentaries that come out every year. They're extremely popular. And they're consistently, all these venues, these media, present science in a story or narrative structure in some way. So it's just not true that storytelling is not used for nonfiction. It's used for nonfiction all the time. The truth is that story, the word story, has been, I admit, more associated with fiction than nonfiction. But when you look below the surface, storytelling is used on both sides of the fence. Now, a third argument that's often made is that it takes too much time and effort. And I think that this is the strongest argument, but really it's not as bad as people make out. Okay. There are some simple, easy to execute ways that can make a huge difference in turning a flat, vanilla, boring lecture that makes people's eyes glaze over to turning it into a dynamic, compelling, interesting story that engages audiences, that they want to listen to the story from start to finish and feel satisfied that they just had a pleasant experience, and sometimes actually even a joyful experience that hopefully, ideally, expanded their horizon. And I think the best, really big example that this is possible and that this has been done over and over is TED Talks. So obviously not all TED Talks are science talks, but there are many, many science talks on TED, and they're presented in a story-like way. The TED system, the TED paradigm teaches the speakers how to do their talks. And this is true for TEDx events as well. So yes, it takes time, it takes effort, but it may not be as hard as you imagine it to be. So let's talk now about the evidence for storytelling. Now, intuitively, you might come to the conclusion that storytelling would work because a good storyteller simplifies complex information and makes it more accessible. But is it just the simplification that makes storytelling work? Is that really the essential element? If you just simplify complex information, that makes it a story? I would say no. I would say there's certainly benefits in simplification, but that's not storytelling alone. And so the question is there actually evidence that storytelling is better than conventional ways of communicating, conventional presentations and lectures and so on? And the answer I would give to you is no and yes. And the no is that, unfortunately, and I've looked very hard, there has never been a randomized study comparing storytelling with non-storytelling, conventional approaches that shows superiority of the storytelling approach. By a randomized study, I'm talking about taking, a group of people, randomly separating them into two groups, exposing one group to storytelling, the other group to non-storytelling on the same topic, and then testing for understanding, for connectedness, for persuasiveness, and some endpoint that you have in mind. So that study, unfortunately, has never been done. However, the answer to that question about is there evidence is also a yes. And the reason I say that is because there have been numerous studies and actually a fair number of entire books that have been written about storytelling being a powerful way to communicate that leads to better understanding, better connections, better persuasiveness. And what is that evidence? So let's spend some time talking about that evidence. I don't want to give you a laundry list of, 20 different things. I want to give you something that's useful that you can remember that is valid and credible. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 lines of evidence or pieces of evidence that support the idea that storytelling really is a better form of communication, including with science. The first line of evidence I would point to is a group at Princeton University that has looked at communication, including using story, and has monitored people, has observed how this affects the brain. And the way that they've done that in many studies that they've published is using functional MRI. And this is a group that's headed by a neuroscientist who's actually given a fantastic talk on TED. His name is Uri Hassan. I would definitely encourage you to see that TED Talk. Functional MRI is a way of looking at the brain that looks at where the cells in the brain, the neurons, are most active, are using the most energy. And it lights up in those areas of the brain, a millisecond by millisecond basis. So you can expose people to various things and see which part of their brain lights up. And that tells you which part of the brain is responding in some way to that stimulus that you gave that person. So what they did was something very interesting. They basically scanned a storyteller and a story listener by functional MRI. And it's not exactly at the same time, but it's essentially at the same time. It's functionally at the same time. So they put the storyteller in the functional MRI machine and they ask him to tell the story, to actually give the presentation while he's in the MRI machine. And then they have the story listener. They put the story listener in the MRI machine and they play that audio to the listener and as well as video. And so it's essentially like scanning the brains of both people at the same time. And what they have found repeatedly and over and over and over is that there are specific areas of brain that light up when they're exposed to information, including storytelling information. And those areas are often related to understanding and emotion. Those areas in the brain are activated by storytelling. But what's really fascinating, in addition to that, is that the patterns that they see in these MRIs are extremely similar and basically match up and look the same in the two brains of the storyteller and the story listener. And they've come up with a name for this, and it's called neural coupling. And what they've reported is that other communication approaches or methods do not result in this neural coupling. So storytelling has this unique property of affecting the brain of the audience in a way that is activating the brain of the speaker. So that's really cool. So another line of evidence comes from a book. The book is called Resistance and Persuasion, and it was published quite a few years ago. There's a chapter in that book entitled Narrative Persuasion and Overcoming Resistance. This was published by a group from the University of Waterloo. And they start by asking an interesting question. I'm going to quote it. If we didn't enjoy narratives, if they have some benefit for us, would we be inclined to watch as much television as we do? Would Hollywood films generate profits in the millions of dollars? They answered with, it seems unlikely. They review many studies that have demonstrated that narratives, stories, touch emotions, that they impact what we believe, that stories teach us new behaviors, that stories shape our cultural identity. And they point out that even governments have concluded that storytelling is a very powerful way to communicate. For example, for anti-drug messages, as well as other communication programs. So they concluded in this chapter that narratives have this uncanny property of overcoming resistance. And they go into some detail regarding how and why this occurs. And there's really a whole body of neuroscience literature on this ability of storytelling to affect human beings by affecting their brains, essentially. The third line of evidence that I want to share with you has to do with a lot of studies suggesting that the human brain has evolved to be receptive to storytelling. This has been written about by quite a number of studies. And there's a whole body of research that suggests that narratives are easier to comprehend. They're more engaging than traditional logical scientific communication. In fact, there was a study on narrative medicine that found that storytelling can help medical and healthcare students develop more empathy, reflective thinking, and that actually improved patient-provider communication. The other thing for the doctors or other healthcare professionals that have gone through medical education, I'm sure you're familiar with case studies. Well, case studies have been used for many years in medical schools. What is a case study if it is not a story about a specific patient and what happened to that patient? We don't think of case studies as quote unquote stories, but in a way, that's exactly what they are, right? The patient presents with some symptoms. We don't know what the diagnosis is. That's story tension. That's creating story tension, which is as we discussed in one of our earlier podcasts, story tension is arguably the most important element of stories that makes a story a story. So every case study that's ever been done that starts with the patient came in with X, Y, Z symptoms, that's setting up tension. And then more tension is set up because the diagnostic testing is done. And then this happened, and then this happened. And then we still don't know what the resolution of the case is. And so by the end of the case, you find out what the diagnosis was, how was the patient treated, how did they respond, and all the tension that was built up in the case study in the beginning is resolved at the end. You've told a story. So this is historical evidence going back decades that story is used in medicine all the time. Now, I actually did a little experiment on my own here because I've really basically been into generative AI and how it could potentially affect my world and medical communication, the medical affairs world, the commercial drug development world. And my favorite generative AI tool is Perplexity, which there is a free version of that. There's also a premium version that has a few benefits. And I posed the following question to this AI tool. The question was, what is the strongest evidence that scientific storytelling is a powerful way to communicate science to healthcare professionals and the general public? I would encourage you to try putting in this question for yourself into whatever AI you like to use, whether it's ChatGPT or Jasper or Bard or other ones. So it came up with very interesting result for the purpose of because of the limits of time. I don't want to read you the details of the answer. The answer was quite specific. It gave me multiple evidence, some of which I've already shared with you, but I do want to share with you what the summary paragraph was. The summary paragraph of this result to this answer to this question was the following. Quote, scientific storytelling is a powerful communication tool because it engages audiences simplifies complex information, and improves understanding and recall of scientific concepts among healthcare professionals and the general public, unquote. One of the reasons, the number one reason why I like Perplexity more than the other AI tools is that Perplexity gives you links in the form of superscripts to basically every sentence in the answer. And in this case, Perplexity gave me 18 links, proof sources that I can go into and check whether what it was saying was actually consistent with the original source. And it was. So this was a really good answer, well supported by, really a lot of evidence. So what I take away from all of this is that there is really overwhelming evidence that storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool to communicate science and medicine, and it is really more effective than traditional data-only based approaches. There's nothing wrong with the data-based classical lecture. They're familiar. They often work very well when done right. Sometimes simplification is all that's necessary. But it's also true that there's a mountain of evidence that the same material, were it presented as a story or a narrative, would have a greater impact. And no less importantly, it probably will be more enjoyed by the audience. So that's a factor I think that we all want to consider, should be considered as an important factor. Does your audience enjoy the process of the communication and the presentation that you give to them? So I'm going to bring this podcast to an end. I hope this has been useful to you. And please write to us and let us know what you think. Ask us questions. And please like and subscribe to the podcast. We would really appreciate that. Again, my name is Dr. Ed Perper. This is the Art of Scientific Storytelling podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.